We're going to get started. So good morning, everybody. Nice. There's more energy than I expected on the very last day of knowledge. So thank you for joining us on the very last session of CreatorCon. I know you had a lot of options about your last session of CreatorCon. You chose this one, and I really appreciate that. Kind of a quick show of hands first, just so I have a read of the audience. How many people have used Service Portal before? Everyone. Almost everyone. That's incredible. Okay, awesome. So these next couple of hours, we're going to be covering a fair amount of topics. Some of them are a little more beginner-oriented. If it's not doing anything for you, that's okay. Stick around. We will be getting to much more advanced content later on in the lab. We're going to be covering a lot of breadth over the course, a lot of different topics, some of which is, a couple of new features in Istanbul. But it's all going to be about this idea of what if we could integrate Spotify and Service Portal and create some sort of like a third-party integrated experience or something like that. We're picking Spotify for a couple of reasons. One, because I use Spotify all the time and I love it and I think it's fun. I listen to a lot of music. I'm sure all of you do too. And I like to kind of keep this stuff fun. But the second reason is that the principles that we kind of learn and get familiar with as we're doing an integration with this third-party API, they're the same principles that you can take back to your own organizations and use to do integrations with maybe more useful tools for your workplaces like Dropbox and Box and SharePoint and about 100 different other things. So the stuff that we learn here and the stuff that we cover, you can use that again, those exact same principles. So without further ado, I think we can just get started. So if you flip to Lab 1, we're going to start with that. I'm going to be doing the lab along with you guys up here on stage and talking about the different things that we're doing and kind of going into the details and talking about the code that we're writing. But we're going to start slow. So the first thing that we're going to do, and you'll want to open up your instance. So if you go to your instance and you type in /sp at the end of your URL, I'm sure you already know this, you get Service Portal. Yay. Awesome. So all of you are probably familiar with this search bar here in the front. And by default, it searches things like Service Catalog and Knowledge Base and Social Q&A. And if I type iPhone, then iPhone results pop up. Very cool. How exciting. But we're going to augment this, and we're going to improve it and extend it to show us search results, artist results from the Spotify API. And to do that, we're going to create a new search source record. And I'm going to talk about what search sources are, if you're not familiar with them, how you use them. If you're on Helsinki, then you haven't seen search sources yet. This might be your first introduction to those. So what we're going to do to start is if you navigate to the platform UI, to open up our list of search sources, all we have to do is type sp_search_source.list. When we hit enter, it takes us to our list of search sources. And here you see three. These are the three that you already see by default on Service Portal. We have Knowledge Base, we have Questions and Answers, we have Service Catalog. If you're interested in how these search results are actually populated, or you're interested in modifying that in some way, you can actually dive right into the code from here. We can see how these different search sources are configured and how they work and how they generate their results. But we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to create a whole new one. So right up here, we're going to click New on Search Sources. And then the name, we're going to provide a name of Spotify Artist Search. And for the ID, we're going to do the same, but we're going to separate with dashes. Awesome. So that's Lab 1. Easy. Yay. It's not all this easy. Lab 2 is actually creating our scripted search source. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means, how we configure them, the different ways that we can extend and utilize our search sources, and the different things that we can make this thing do. So to start with, we're going to skip over the template. We will talk about the template. But the first thing I want you to see here is this field called roles. So with these search sources, we have power over configuring who can see what search results or who can see what content from different search, right? We can do that from the script and just generate results that people can, just the results that people can see. But we can also limit access to the search source itself to identify whether or not we're even going to run through this search field What's that? Yeah. Here we go. Let me zoom in. That's good. Awesome. And this roles field is what allows us to do that. So when we provide roles in here, like say a role of admin or a role of ITIL, we're modifying who can see this search source or who can see the results of it. Starting with Jakarta, we're actually shipping a new feature. If you're familiar with user criteria, then you're already kind of familiar with how this feature works. Basically, we've added user criteria support to Service Portal for search sources as well as widgets, widget instances, and pages. So what that means, if you're not familiar with user criteria, is these roles fields, they're cool, and we can use these to limit the access to these search sources as well as other things. But sometimes they're just not powerful enough, right? Like, sometimes it really is as simple as saying, I only want admins to see this record, or I only want admins or ITIL users to be able to see this page. But once you start getting into the territory of, I want my users in North America who are members of the IT group, or who have one of these 3 roles, or whose name is Patrick, can see this page and everyone else can't, then that's the kind of stuff that you can't really mimic with roles anymore, right? And that's what user criteria allows us to do. A user criteria record is a record that allows you to kind of define these very complex selectors for users that can define much more complicated ways of assessing who does or doesn't have permission to see something. It's really powerful stuff. That's available in Jakarta, again, for search sources, widgets, widget instances, and pages. But we're not going to use any of those things in this lab, but I did want to just kind of call it out and so that you guys were all aware of what's coming down the pipeline. So we're going to jump right down here to data source. And this is where we define the content that is produced by our search source record. And there's actually 2 ways to generate that content. We have the simple search source configuration, which is here, where we can just define a table that we want to search over. Maybe some conditions or some filter. For example, I only want to be able to search over active incidents, or maybe I just want to search over problems assigned to me. That's where we can configure this. And we can also configure a primary display field that is based upon whatever table that you've selected that you want to show in the top of the template at the top of the search result. And we can also choose some other fields that we want to render as well. This is a simple way to configure it. You don't really have to change anything in the template to do this. It's kind of the quickest way to get up and running. But we're developers and we're okay with writing script. We're not going to shy away from that. So instead, we're going to click is scripted source. And now we're getting into the more advanced form of search source configuration. This is where we can write just a script that, however it wants to, can generate some search results in some way. And this script will run on the server. And then it'll return back an array of results. And that's what we pass back to our search results. And this is what we're going to do here. From here, we're going to call into the Spotify API, retrieve some results, pull them back, and then render them onto the page. So to get the code for that, if you head over to GitHub, which should be open on another tab. If not, go ahead and open it up. And we're going to click into this folder, Lab 2. We're going to start here with data fetch script. So go ahead, take a moment to copy and paste this content into that data fetch script block. Just like that. Awesome. Now let's take a moment to kind of look through here and see what we're actually doing. Okay, so here we have a function that takes as a parameter a query, which is actually injected by the widget that calls into the script, so you don't have to worry about how query gets generated. But we're going to use that query string to figure out how to generate these search results. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up our URL that we're going to be calling into, which is this api.spotify.com. A side note, Spotify actually has a lot of APIs that you can use if you're ever interested in building some more apps or some more extensions on top of it. And many of the APIs, such as this one, don't actually require any authentication to go and get that data. That's one of the big reasons why we chose to use Spotify for this lab, was so we didn't have to mess with OAuth or mess with user accounts or anything like that. And here we're just passing in a URL as well as we're encoding that query into an encoded query so that we can pass it over to Spotify as well. And then here we're setting up a new Glide HTTP request, which is something that the platform offers us. Again, since this is just a server script, we can actually do anything in here that we can do in any other server script, as well as the server scripts of widgets and all of that. So we can do Glide record queries, we can leverage the platform, we can kick off new workflows, we can do whatever we want from there. But in this case, we're just going to make an HTTP call out to Spotify. Then we're going to pass in that result. We'll get some JSON output as a result, which happens synchronously. And then with that JSON result, we're going to start populating this results array. And that's kind of happening right here. So here we're taking that JSON object that came back, we're decoding it, and we're basically just getting the body of that JSON output. Don't worry too much about how this code looks. If you write your own extension points or extension hooks, you'll probably be able to just use something that looks very similar to this. And then we're going to iterate over the response that came back and all the artists and everything, and we're going to start populating this results array with these objects. And basically, each one of the objects in this array represents a search result. And we can actually take that data and render it onto a template, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And in this case, we're actually passing in 2 or 3 kind of important fields that you'll want to make sure are populated inside of your search results. The first is result.url. And this is how we determine where we want the user to be taken to if they select that search result, for example, from a type ahead field. The type ahead field is as you start typing, you see the results kind of coming down and populating the screen. If you click one of those, it will direct the user to whatever is inside of this URL field. And you can put other service portal pages in here. You can put external links in here, whatever you want. In this case, we're going to link to a page called Spotify Artist, which doesn't exist yet, but we will be making it. And that's going to be our page. It's actually going to let us see details about our artist and view a couple of their top tracks and even play them. And we're going to be getting to that in labs 3, 4, 5, and 6. And the second is this score field. So score is how we determine what order that we're rendering these search results. So that's why when I type iPhone, I see iPhone 6 right up at the very top, because that record's score was the highest, because we had the highest degree of confidence that that is the thing that that user was searching for. We're generating score, in this case, kind of naively. I'm sure there might be a better way for us to be able to do this. But in this case, we're just setting score to 100 for the first result that comes back, 99 for the next result, and so on, and just kind of hoping that Spotify sends us the artists in the right order that it thinks that we should do. So if I type in something like Led Zeppelin, I'll get actual Led Zeppelin first and not some cover band or something like that. And then we're returning that results array. So that's it. That's everything to do with the data fetch script. And the second thing that we're going to look at is our search page template. And that's that field right up here that I skipped earlier. So first thing, we're going to go back to GitHub, and we're going to copy in that content from template.html. Copy that, paste it over here. Here we go. OK. So this is the, when you type in a search result and you click search, you're taken to a search results page. And all those different search results, they can look different depending on the record that was retrieved or depending on the thing that was searched, right? You might see upvote and downvote scores if you're searching in social QA, or you might see a picture of an item inside of a service catalog or search result. And this is how we configure that, is through this search page template. And search page template just relies on one field, and that's item. And off of item, maybe intuitively, that item is one of those search results that we passed back in that array earlier. So all of the fields that you set onto that search result in your data fetch script, those properties are available inside of this template, and you can start embedding them onto the page. In our case, we're showing an image on the very top, an image that's associated with that artist, maybe an artist picture, an album cover, or something like that. We're also showing the artist's name. We're showing a list of genres that that artist is associated with. And then we're providing a link to Spotify to actually do a deep link into the Spotify application, if any of you have it open on your computers. If not, I think it'll just open up Spotify in a new tab. And this will allow us to open up that artist inside of Spotify. So here, in this case, if I click on the name of the artist, I'll be taken to our Spotify artist page that we'll be building. And if I click on Open Artist in Spotify, then it'll open the artist inside of an external link. And finally, I want to talk about type ahead. So down here in the related list, down here in the tab in the form, if you click over into type ahead, you'll see that we can start doing some configuration of those type ahead search results to come down. We can turn it on or off by clicking this enable type ahead box. Maybe some results you don't want to show, via type ahead. And there's also this checkbox called advanced type ahead configuration. And that actually allows us to modify the template that, that our search results actually look like inside of those type ahead results. So we can do some pretty complex things in there. A good place to look for maybe inspiration or an example of where we're using this is the service catalog results. If you click over into the service catalog search source, you'll actually see that we are conditionally rendering either some icons if an item is of one type, or we're showing a tiny little picture of the service catalog item if it's an item type. We're not going to do that here because in our case, we're just going to show a little Spotify logo next to our search results. So if you click into this type ahead glyph box, if you search for Spotify, you'll actually find a Spotify icon. Click into that. And then this last field here, we're going to leave this blank, and it's called page. And in the event that you have configured a simple search source and you haven't written script and you haven't provided that URL field in a way that's scripted, this is how you can tell Service Portal what Service Portal page you want to open up those search results in. So for example, you might have configured a simple search to search over active incidents. And when you click one of those active incidents, you might want to open that in a form. And in this case, you can just provide the form page, something like that, right? We're not going to do that because we've already configured our search, our data fetch script to open up a URL, so we don't need to populate that. Now, once we've done all of that, we can click Submit. And here it is right here. So now we have our Spotify artist search source as well as our other search sources. However, you'll find that if we actually navigate over to Service Portal and we try searching for something, you'll notice that nothing comes up. And that's because we haven't actually mapped our search source that we've built over onto our portal yet. So again, like, it's not enough to just create that search source record. In Lab 3, we're also going to learn how to add that search source onto our portal so that we can start showing those search results. And I'm just going to give you guys 1 or 2 minutes. I think we're probably all mostly on the same page, but I'm just going to provide a minute for anyone to catch up that wants to. And then we're going to move on to Lab 3. Okay, so we're going to push on here. So now that we've created our search source record, now we need to learn how to map it over into our portal. And to do that is easy. All you have to do is in the platform UI, you can search for portal, and then click this link here that says portals. And that's going to open up our portal records inside of a list right here in the center. And here we're seeing all the different portals that are on our instance. We have a CAB Workbench portal, we have benchmarks. And here's the one that we want. We want the one that's called Service Portal. That's the portal that we're going to be using for the duration of this class. So if we click into that, we see all the different ways that we can configure our portal. Many of you are probably familiar with most of these ways. What you might not have seen yet is this related list on the bottom of the screen that's called Search Sources. And this is how we tell our portal when we search inside of a page or when we search inside of one of those type ahead search boxes. This is how we determine what we want to show there. So in this case, we're just showing knowledge-based questions and answers in Service Catalog. And we can remove any of these if we want. If we don't want to search Service Catalog or Q&A on this portal, then we can remove that. In this case, we're actually going to add something. So click Edit next to Search Sources. And then from this list, which will probably only have one record in it, so easy to find, go ahead and double-click Spotify Artist Search, and that'll move it over into the list on the right. Then once you've clicked Save, when we scroll back down to that list, we'll see it there. And we'll also see it next to this field called Order. Order is pretty simple. When we show the search page results on the full screen, we show a list of different search sources on the left. This order is how you determine what order those search results show in. And that's about all it does. So I'm not going to change mine right now. I'm OK with just the order that it's showing up in here. So that's it. Now our search source has been mapped to our portal. So if we head over to our portal index page and we refresh the page, now when I search for Radiohead, I should see search results come up. Awesome. And you guys search for whoever your favorite artist is and make sure that they're coming up. But when I hit enter on it, I'm obviously taken to a 404 page because we haven't built out the artist page yet for this. And if I go back, and if I search for an artist, and then I just hit enter, I'm actually taken to the search page results. And these templates, the way that this looks here, in all its beauty, I designed this myself. This is how we determined this by the search page template in our search source. So this is how you can configure these search results as well to show some pretty cool stuff. In this case, album artwork, genre names, a link over here that if I click will open the artist up in Spotify. Awesome. So here we've learned that we can extend the behavior of Service Portal without actually having to clone or create any widgets, right? Which is awesome. We've seen a lot of people, they wanted to extend the search functionality of their portal, so they started cloning or creating their own search widgets and everything like that, which, as much as I love people writing their own widgets, that shouldn't be necessary just for extending search, right? So here we've learned a way where we can extend the functionality of Service Portal without having to do any of that. And we could have even extended this search functionality without actually writing a line of code. In this case, we didn't. We used some code to go and generate some artist results. But unfortunately, nothing really happens yet when we click one of these results. And that's what we're going to cover for the duration of the lab is how we can do some pretty cool stuff inside of that artist page to do things like show us search results and coordinate API calls up to Spotify and things like that. So I'm going to provide one more minute, and then we're going to move on to lab 4. Actually, are there any questions about search sources or anything? Okay, awesome. I'm also going to take this opportunity to show one more feature that's coming in Jakarta. And it's called, we call it contextual search results or contextual search sources. So one feature that we've seen requested quite a bit is, in these type ahead search boxes that are right up here on the top of many of our screens, we've had customers that said, I like search and I like this ability that I can configure how search behaves. But when I'm on like a service catalog page, I want that search box to only show me service catalog results. And on a knowledge base page, I want it to only show me knowledge results. So we've added a feature where if you configure the instance options of these type ahead search widgets, starting with Jakarta, you'll now see a field on here called contextual search sources. And here you can provide one or more search source records that, if provided, will limit the search results to just those items. So here I've provided just service catalog. So if I search for something like iPhone, I'm only seeing service catalog results coming up. I can also add knowledge base to that. And now when I search iPhone, I'm also seeing some knowledge base results and stuff come in here, but nothing from social QA. So this is how you can configure the search experience on specific pages inside of Service Portal. And this is new to Jakarta. You can do it on all of your instances. These are actually Jakarta instances. And if you leave it blank, then you're just searching whatever is available on the portal, whatever you've mapped onto the portal. And if you haven't mapped any search sources to your portal, then we actually look at a system property on the system called default search sources, and we pull from those records instead. The reason we did that is because you can actually create Service Portal pages that aren't in any portal, and we wanted to give users the ability to show what search results happen in those pages as well. And you can change that system property to change what those default searches are, or leave it blank and no one will ever see any searches. But I don't know why you'd want to do that. So. Okay, so let's start talking about Lab 4, creating a page. This is kind of basic creating a page stuff. If you're already familiar with how to create pages, just hold on because we're going to start doing some really cool stuff as we get into Lab 5. Cool, so now we want to build that artist result page. So to do that, we're going to type in configuration into this, into the navigator on the platform UI. Actually, you want to type service portal configuration. There's a lot of ways to configure service now. Okay, here we are. And now we have the service portal configuration pages open here. And this gives us a lot of tools if this is your first time looking at this, or maybe you've been using Service Portal in the past, but you've been using mostly the platform UI with our lists and forms to configure Service Portal and to work with it. We actually provide a lot of tools just right here that are all built inside of Service Portal that allow you to work a little bit better with Service Portal. We have things like the branding editor, which will allow you to modify the branding of your portal in a pretty intuitive way. We have the Service Portal Designer, which we're going to use in, well, actually, I don't think, yeah, which we'll be using here in just a second, which allows us to create and maintain pages and modify the layouts of those pages. We also have the page editor and a portal editor, which is up here, which gives us these cool kind of tree diagram views of all of the records that make up what a page is or what a portal is, which is super useful if you'd spend a lot of time clicking around between all the different records, containers and rows and columns, instances and page records that make up portal. This provides a slightly better UI on top of, moving through some of those relationships and seeing those relationships. And finally, we have our widget editor, which allows you to kind of create new widgets from scratch and allows you to modify existing widgets or clone widgets that we provide you out of the box. So in our case, we're actually going to open up the Designer and create a new page from there. So go ahead and click Designer, and that's going to open up a new tab with the Service Portal Designer inside of it. So these are all the pages that we can configure inside of our portal. We're actually going to create a new page, so we're going to click this link on the top that says Add a New Page. And here we can provide a title and we can provide an ID. Now, a quick note about an error that's in your printed lab guides. So your printed lab guides say that the artist page ID should be Spotify-artist. You actually want that to be Spotify_artist. In general, you'll want to make sure the page IDs use underscores. Actually, when you type in the page name, it'll automatically produce an ID for you that uses an underscore. Just keep that one. Don't change it to a dash or anything like that. It'll break the search source that we built earlier because we configured that to link to the dash, or to the underscore, not to the dash. But this is an easy rule to follow because, again, the designer is just going to do it the right way for us. So if you spell it right, which I can't. Here we go. So now we have a page title and we have a page ID. And when we submit this, it'll open up that new page for us inside of the Service Portal Designer. Now here, we're going to create a new page that has a layout with 9 units on the left side of the screen and 3 units on the right side of the screen. And we're going to put 2 different widgets onto this page. One of them is actually already provided for us out of the box. It's called the Spotify Artist Details widget, and the other one we're going to create from scratch. So the first thing that we're going to do to set up this layout is we're going to take this box that looks like a 9 and a 3. This is a layout box, and it's going to quickly bootstrap this layout with the container row and the columns that we need, and we can just start putting our widgets into that. So go ahead, click and drag this, and drag it onto the screen until you see this hover state. And when you let go, you see that that container was generated with a column here and another column over here. Okay, now we're going to put a widget onto the page. So to do that, we're going to search for Spotify Artist Details over here on the left. And we're going to click and drag that widget over onto the screen as well. Awesome. It says, oops, no artist ID provided. That's just sort of the default empty state if you don't give it an artist to render. So if you see that, then you know that you've done it right. So if you see that, awesome, good job. Cool. So we're going to take a look at this widget and see how it works. But first, we're going to make sure that our page is actually working. So you shouldn't have to save or press the save button or anything like that. The page is already available for us. So if we go back into our portal, and we click over to the home screen, I'm going to refresh my tab just to make sure that the changes have made it over. And when I search for an artist, and if I arrow key down to it and I select this artist, I should see this page with a whole lot of blank space on the left, and then this artist details widget over here on the right, which shows us information like how many followers are on that artist, how popular they are on a star of 1 to 5, as well as a bunch of related artists. And if we click into any of these related artist links, we can actually open up their artist pages as well. With all this ugly blank space over here on the left. And that's what we're going to address with our new top tracks widget, which we're going to create from scratch. Cool, so let's go and take a look at that widget and see how it works. We can do that from the widget editor, and over here on the top of the screen, you should see something that says Spotify Artist Details. If you don't, that's okay. You can also locate it through this reference picker down here, but I'm just gonna click this one. Awesome, and here we're seeing all the code that drives this widget. Here we see all the template information for showing our artist details, and we see a panel where we're showing followers and all that kind of thing. None of this is probably all too new to most of you guys. And here we're, inside of our client script, we're leveraging the Spotify API service, which we're going to talk about how this is built and what it's doing. But we're using that service to get our artists and to get related artists through two different kind of calls out. And we're pulling back some data and we're rendering that stuff onto the widget. And we're going to learn a lot more about how that Spotify API service works and why we're using it at all as a part of Lab 5 and also our bonus lab 5.5, which isn't in your printouts, but you can follow along with me anyway. And we're going to learn some better ways to build these REST APIs and how to coordinate things and some of the problems that we're going to run into as a part of Lab 5. So I'm going to give you guys just a minute to catch up, and then I'm going to push on to Lab 5, creating a new widget. Okay, so we've got this fresh new service portal page, but there's that big blank spot in the center left of the page, and we want to fill that up with a widget that displays the artist's name, maybe a couple of extra artist details, but more importantly, a list of whatever their top tracks are, which we're going to pull out of Spotify. Later on, we're also going to provide a play button that'll allow us to actually embed a song player right inside there. So we can actually listen to the tracks that we're embedding. But for now, we're just going to create a simple version of that widget. We're going to go through a few iterations of this widget as we kind of improve it and as we make it more performant. So the first step is, of course, to create the widget. And we can do that if you're already inside the widget editor like this. We can do that by clicking this hamburger icon up here and clicking the Create New Widget link. There's also a clone Spotify Artist Details link, which, if you're not familiar with cloning, allows us to take all the contents of that widget that we made and produce an entirely new widget from those contents. This is really useful if you want to clone default widgets that we don't allow you to modify for one reason or another, or if you just already have kind of a starting point with one widget and you want to generate a new widget off of that as a starting point for something new. But we're going to click Create New Widget in this case. Now here we see a pop-up that's got two inputs for our widget, widget name and a widget ID. Once again, the widget ID should be automatically generated for us when we type in Spotify top tracks. Awesome. You can go ahead and leave the ID the way that it is. And we're going to leave this box down here unchecked, Create Test Page, but I do want to talk about what it does. So when we create a widget, we have this option to also create a page for that widget. And when we click that and we click Submit, when we generate the widget, we're also going to generate an instance for that widget, and we're going to generate a new page record with a container and a row and a column that widget is going to sit inside of. This is really useful if you're creating a sort of a single-purpose widget, or maybe you're creating a large full-page widget, and you just want to quickly bootstrap a page for that widget, and you don't want to go through the designer and create all those containers and rows and stuff. Create Test Page will actually do that for us. So super valuable, super powerful. But we're going to leave it unchecked because we already have a home for this widget. So go ahead and click Submit. And now we're taken to our new widget, Spotify Top Tracks. To see more of the fields of the widget, we can click HTML template, CSS, and server script. I'm not going to talk about how this widget works. I'm going to assume that most of you guys are already familiar with how widgets work at a kind of a high level. If not, there's a helpful little diagram inside of your lab guides that goes through the specifics of how client scripts and server scripts interact with each other, which are totally free to read. It's a pretty cool diagram. But we're not going to talk too much about it unless there are questions about it later, in which case I can totally go over it. But from here, we're going to start building out our widget. And to start with, we're going to do it from GitHub. just by copying and pasting in the code. So if you head into the Case 17 Service Portal Spotify repository, look for this folder that's called Lab 5, not the one that says Lab 5 Bonus Lab. We're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. But for now, we're going to just use this version of the widget. So click into this field, client.js, and all the other fields, and copy them over into the right spots. Make sure that they're in the right spots and that you didn't get any wires crossed, or else this widget definitely won't work. Okay, and once you've copied in all those fields, CSS should be blank. That's okay. We're not providing any CSS right now. And then if you press Command-S or Control-S on Windows machines, or you can just press the Save button at the top, we can save our widget. And now from here, kind of the undocumented step that got left out of the lab, but now we actually have to go and add that widget to our page through the designer, or else nothing's going to work. So let's open up our designer. Hopefully you already have it open in another page. If not, that's okay. I'm going to refresh my page. I just like to make sure everything is always up to date. And then when I search in this filter over here, I'll see Spotify Top Tracks, which is my new widget. And I'll take that and I'll drag it over into the column on the left. And when I put that in, I see this blue box that indicates that there is a widget there. If there was a better empty state there, then we would also see, maybe a nice little empty state of, please provide an artist ID or something like that, which is good practice. I didn't do it here, so sorry. But you could always modify your widget and do it yourself. Okay, so once we've done that, let's go see if our page works. So I have an artist open over here. I actually don't know who it is. So if I refresh the page and everything worked, here we go. Now I see that it's Arcade Fire, and I see a list of all of their top tracks. But if I press these play buttons, it says playing songs is not yet supported. We're going to get to that at the end of the lab. Awesome. Okay, so let's go talk about that widget and see how it's doing what it's doing. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the problems in the widget as it exists right now. Maybe you guys are already going to kind of be catching on to what these problems are and thinking about how you would solve it. So here we have a template for our widget. Nothing really fancy or special going on here. It's just a simple Angular template where we're doing a couple of bindings and then iterating over the top tracks, right? Nothing too complicated there, nothing out of the ordinary. But over here in our server script is where kind of the more interesting magic is happening. So here we're doing, we're grabbing our artist ID variable, which we can generate from an option. If that is how you would want to provide an artist ID, maybe you're embedding the widget onto the page and you want it to show a certain artist every time. Or we're just getting it, if the option is not provided, which is not in this case, then we're just getting it from the URL parameter via $sp.get parameter. And that's why we make that parameter available up here in the URL, and that's how we link our widget to a particular thing. There's no artist ID, we error out, great. And then here we're doing something very similar to what we already saw in that data source script. I'll zoom in on it, but there's nothing too different about it. And that's kind of problem number one, right, is that we have duplicate code in here. So here we're making a call out to api.spotify.com, getting an artist, doing that request, pulling it back, and then building a data.artist record off of that. Now, earlier I kind of hinted at this idea, but here we're kind of really starting to see why this might be a problem. And that's that server scripts are synchronous, right, in nature. So that means that as we kind of step through and iterate over this code, as we step through this code, we set up this REST API call, and we package it up, and then we send it over the network to Spotify, right? And then we wait some amount of time for it to come back. Eventually it comes back, and then we execute the next line of code. And then we go down a little bit farther, and we do the exact same thing again. We make a call out to a top tracks URL. Spotify does its thing for a little bit, eventually it gets back to us. There's all that over the wire time. And then we get back a response with those top tracks from that Spotify artist, and then we're building our record based on that. which means that to render this one widget, we're making a call out to the ServiceNow instance, which calls to Spotify, which comes back, which calls to Spotify, which comes back, and then returns back to our client so we can actually render that page. And this is kind of a problem for two reasons. One is that it's making the execution of this server script a lot slower because we're doing the same thing 2 times in a row. And the second problem, and this is kind of one of those concepts within Service Portal that as you start building widgets you'll want to be familiar with, is that the server script of a widget, when we run it for the first time, when we're generating the widget that's on the page, the first thing we do before we show any UI is we execute through the server script of that widget. Usually we build up some data object and then we pass that back to the client, right? And then we render the widget. So that's what I call like a blocking action. So that means that before we can render the page at all, before we stop showing the loading screen at all to the user, we have to run through all of the server scripts on all of the widgets that are on our page. And if any of those server scripts are slow, it holds up the loading time of every other widget and every other component on that page. So the user sees nothing for that period of time. So during the time that we're making all of these calls out to Spotify, our user sees nothing, which is kind of a problem, right? Surely there's a way that we can make this a little bit more performant, or that we can maybe even try and encapsulate some of this information that's here. And there is, and that's what we're going to talk about as part of the bonus lab 5.5, which is not in your lab printouts, but please follow along anyway, because I think that this is some of the cooler content in the lab, and this is something that you'll definitely run into in your own widgets. I'm going to just take 1 minute to kind of set it up, and then we're going to push on. So if you're not caught up yet, go ahead, take this time to catch up. Okay, so here we are, lab 5.5, the bonus level. And right now we're dealing with this issue where we have this page and we have 2 widgets on that page, right? And in this case, they're both making server script calls out to api.spotify.com. So this problem actually runs a little bit deeper than we first thought when we were talking about the top tracks, because our second widget on the screen, it might also be pulling data in from Spotify, which means that it might also be making these round-trip calls out to the Spotify API, which means that we're generating the same data twice in each widget and within the widget, which means that we're doing the same thing 4 times, which is a huge problem, right? And these problems, really there's 2 main problems, which I already talked about. Initial execution of that widget server script is blocking, so we can't render the page until we complete both of those REST calls in order. We don't even do them at the same time, we do them one after the other. So that's a long time to wait. And the second is that we're making 2 calls to get the same data twice on each of these 2 widgets. They're each making both of their own unique calls out. They're not smart enough to be able to coordinate and say, okay, since we have to go and call out to the artist API, you do it, and then I'll just wait for your result to come down, and then I'll use that result. Those widgets aren't communicating with each other like that, right? But I think that there's a way that we can make these 2 widgets to communicate with each other and coordinate these API calls a little bit better. So instead of having a structure that looks like this, where both widget is individually making these calls out from the server script, instead we're going to add this new layer called Spotify API service, and I alluded to this earlier, that's going to act as kind of an intermediary between these 2 widgets. So now when a widget makes a call out to the API to get that data, it's not going to do it through a REST call from the server script. It's going to do it through a call to this Spotify API service, which is a client-side Angular service. We're going to call to that from the client. Both widgets are going to do that, and then that service is going to facilitate talking to the server from there. And we get 2 big benefits from being able to do this. So since we're doing the call from the client side, our page can load all that external data that was fetched, which means that we can show loading screens and stuff because we're not blocking the screen anymore, right? Whatever can render quickly on the page renders quickly on the page, and whatever widgets need a little more time to call out to Spotify to get some content and bring it back, they can go ahead and take the time to do that. And we can show a loading spinner, or we can show kind of an indicator that something is happening on the screen, and that leads to a much more responsive experience for our users, right? Because that's what we want. We want even if this isn't actually taking all that much more time to do because we're still making those calls out to the server, right? We're still making a call out to an external endpoint, but it feels faster. And the only thing better than an app that is fast is an app that feels fast. And we can use that new service to facilitate requests to make sure that the same call isn't being made over the network. But the kind of the the secondary benefit that we get out of that is since we have that other service that's facilitating those calls, we can actually use that service to also cache those calls as they come back. Which means that when we make a call out to the Spotify artist paid API or something like that, and we get back those results, or that service gets back those results, we can kind of presume that the information related to Radiohead isn't going to change all that often, right? They don't come out with new albums every couple of minutes. No artist really changes with all that much frequency, which means that it's a perfect candidate for caching. And caching this stuff means that we don't have to even make that call out to the network at all when other widgets request the same data in the future during the life cycle of the app, which leads to super fast experiences, which means that if you click the back button, we can just load that page immediately because we already have all that data there. And the code for this new and improved Top Tracks widget is on GitHub as well. So that's under, let's go ahead and get that actually right now. Folder 5.5's bonus lab, and then Spotify Top Tracks. So we're going to copy over this code, and then we're going to take a deeper look and figure out how this thing is working and the kind of patterns and the code patterns that we're leveraging to get this to work. As you're copying and pasting, you might notice that the server script is way smaller now, which is what we want. Okay, so once we've done that, we're going to click over back into our artist page. And when we hit refresh, uh-oh, widget broke. Why did that happen? Let's find out. You can open up your, if you're in, I use Chrome. If any other browser that you use has these developer tools as well. You guys are developers, so you're probably already pretty comfy with the Chrome developer tools or Safari or something else. And here we're getting this error, unknown provider, Spotify API provider, Spotify API. Basically this big gross Angular error message that's telling us, I don't know what this Spotify API thing is. And if we look over into our widget, we see that we're using this service that it's complaining about, Spotify API. And this is Angular telling us, I don't know how you got this, but I don't know what it is. So we need to tell this widget, we need to tell Service Portal that this Spotify API dependency or this service, that we want to be able to use it inside of our widget. So we can do that from the platform UI. So if you go ahead and search for widgets inside of the navigator and click into Service Portal and then widgets, and then I'm going to search for star Spotify. And we're going to click into this Spotify Top Tracks. Awesome. So here we see all the content of our widget. And then at the bottom here, we see tons of related lists, and these are all the different things that we can map onto widgets. There's templates, and there's lists that tell us what's where this widget is included and what pages. We can include script dependencies from ServiceNow. And we can also provide these two things, Angular providers and dependencies. In this case, we're dealing with the dependencies. So a dependency, a widget dependency, if you're not familiar with it, it's a way that we can take third-party external code and external content, both JavaScript and CSS, and we can actually package it up in the form of a dependency and then map it onto a widget. So to give you kind of a more concrete example, let's say that you wanted to use something like the Angular drag and drop module that exists, a very popular third-party Angular open source module. And you want to leverage that inside of one of your widgets because you're building a drag and drop interface and you want to use that. Well, to include it inside of one of those widgets, all you have to do is create a new dependency package in here. I'm not actually going to do this. I just want to show you kind of how this looks. And you can provide it a name. You can provide it an Angular module name if it's an Angular module. And then from there, you can basically map on different JavaScript libraries as well as CSS files and things like that, which you can just copy paste into UI scripts inside of the instance, which makes it trivially easy to pull in jQuery extensions or Angular modules or JavaScript libraries like Redux. You can pull all that stuff in and map them onto your widgets, and then when that widget is loaded onto a page at some point in the Service Portal kind of application lifecycle, Service Portal will actually make calls out and go and grab that content dynamically, so you don't have to do anything. It won't load in that content if there are no widgets on the page that need it, which is why we require this sort of dependency step. Now, we already have a dependency record, or we already have a dependency package inside of this instance for that Spotify API. That's how our top tracks artist is still, or our artist details widget is still working. All we have to do is add it over by pressing the edit button. So in the dependencies related list, press edit. You'll see a giant list of things. And then if I search for Spotify API service, then I'll see it right there. So if I double click that and I press save, now when I scroll back down to the bottom of that related list, I'll see Spotify API service as a dependency. And basically this means when this widget gets loaded onto the page, take this dependency package along with it. And I'm going to show you guys what that actually looks like and what the contents are. So when I step into this widget dependency, I see the name, I see the Angular module name, which in this case it's called K17 Spotify Service. This is like a third-party kind of library. The third party is me, I built it, but it could have been someone else, right? And then I see a JS include file on here with a name, an order, so that you can specify the order in which these different JavaScript files get loaded in. Sometimes that's important, sometimes it's not. That's up to you to decide depending on the thing that you're pulling in. And I'm providing a UI script called K17 Spotify Service. And when I click into that, I see some raw Angular code. And this is something you don't see too much of in Service Portal world. A lot of times we try to abstract you away from actually having to write raw Angular code. But if you ever do want to, or if you ever do want to include some Angular module that you wrote yourself or that someone else wrote, this is how you can include it into that into your widget. And here I'm creating a module called K17 Spotify Service, and I'm giving it a name of Spotify API. And Spotify API service is pretty simple. It only takes one dependency, $HTTP, and it uses that Angular service to make calls out to the REST API to pull back data. And here I'm providing 3 different endpoints, one called getArtist, one called getRelatedArtist, and one called getTopTracks. And they're actually all very similar to each other. They're doing just about the same thing. So I'm just going to talk about getArtist and how that one works, and you can kind of extrapolate that over into how the other 2 services work as well. So when we call getArtist, we're passing in an artist ID. And this is how we know which artist to get, and it's also how we know how to cache that result too. And that's what this artist cache variable is. So here you see that I'm defining these 3 objects. They're empty objects to start with, and these are just simple cache objects. And here I'm doing a check. If artist cache for that artist ID, that key, if it exists, return that. And that's basically my way of saying, if I've already fetched this artist ID from this service, then just return to me whatever you returned the last time, or whatever you returned the first time you executed this call. And that's how this cache is implemented. It's super simple. It's the most simple version of a cache that we could do. But then if it doesn't exist, then we step onto this next part of the code. And that's where we're saying that the artist cache for that artist ID is going to be equal to the result of calling this $HTTP thing. And in $HTTP, this is just an Angular service. There's tons of documentation online. You might have used it yourself if you've done a little more Angular development beyond just a couple of widgets. Or you might have used $HTTP inside your widgets. And here we're saying that we're going to set the contents of that cache equal to the result of our get call to this URL. And this is how we're saying, here's where we want to go and get the data from, and then we're going to pull it back. Now, we're actually making a call out to a ServiceNow API here. And I'm going to talk about that a little more at the end of the lab for why we're doing that. But this could be any REST endpoint, right? We could also provide some other REST endpoint here. And we're saying .then, which is a promise. So this $HTTP function, this returns something called a promise. And if you're familiar with maybe ES6 or one of the promise libraries like an Angular or like a Q or something like that, a promise is basically an assurance of some value that's going to come at some point in the future. And this is how we handle something called asynchronicity inside of JavaScript. Remember earlier I was talking about we have this server script, but when we execute glide HTTP request, it's blocking. We can't continue executing the code because we're waiting for that line of code to finish executing. This is how we get around that. This is how we say, okay, make this call out to this service, and I don't know when it's going to come back. So while I'm waiting for it to come back, just go do something else. And then when eventually that thing does come back, then I can handle it inside of this .then, aptly named .then. So at some point in the future, maybe a few milliseconds, maybe a minute, I don't know, that Spotify API is going to return with some value. And I want to resolve it with response.data.result. And that's basically me saying, take the contents of that response and just give me the result of it. This will vary depending on what API you called out to and how it returns its contents. And then right down here, I'm returning the contents of the artist cache, which in this case is not data, it's a promise of data. And that's a hugely important distinction to make. If I try and inspect the contents of what I get when I call this getArtist thing, I'm not going to see the results of my call, right? I'm going to see a new promise object that says, use this object to get the results when I give them to you. And you're going to see how we're using that inside of our widget. So this is how our basic cache implementation is working. And I want to show you guys how we're leveraging it inside of our new widget. Oh, we added the new provider, so we can actually refresh this page, and we should see it start working. Awesome. I want to show you guys the contents of this widget. There's a quick little trick that I can do that. If you're not familiar with it, it's kind of hidden functionality. A lot of people know about it. A lot of people don't. So if you hold the control key on your keyboard and you're logged in as an administrator, you can right-click any widget and see a ton of different information about that widget. We can edit the instance options from here. We can dump data out into console for easy debugging. We can open up that widget in the editor. We can open up this page in the designer. There's a lot of stuff that we can do, little shortcuts. In this case, we're just going to open up this widget inside of the editor, and it's going to pop that open inside of a new tab. So if you're not familiar with that, get familiar with it, because it's pretty useful. And here, I just want to talk about the client script and the server script for a second. The first thing you'll notice is that this server script is pretty empty now. We're really not doing anything inside of it. All we're doing is we're getting the artist ID, which now we're appending to the data object because we're going to use it in the client. And we're doing a little bit of a handler to say if there is no data artist, just return an error. And now all of kind of the heavy lifting and all of the real code that we're writing has been offloaded onto the client script. The advantage to that is that we have almost no server script to run, which means that we have almost no time to wait until we're ready to render the page, which is just awesome. And here we're doing two calls out to Spotify API, and we're saying Spotify API, which is that module that we were looking at earlier, .getArtist, and here we're passing in c.data.artistID, which we generated from the server script. And then we're calling that .then thing again. And again, that's us chaining off of our promise, right? And we're saying .then, when that promise resolves, I want to do something with the response from that promise, with the result of that promise. And in this case, all I have to do is set c.data.artist equal to that response. And that's it. That's how our new API is implemented. And the really powerful thing about this, and the reason why we did a cache in the first place, is that this will only make a call out to the HTTP service if it has to, if it's new data. If it doesn't, it still returns a promise, but that promise resolves immediately, which is pretty cool. So once that promise is done resolving, anytime we chain off of it in the future, it's just going to be there ready for us, which means that there's no time that we actually have to wait if we loaded Radiohead twice. We'll do the exact same thing for c.getTopTracks. Same format. We're also generating an embedded player URL off of $SCE, which if there are questions about that, I can talk about that at the end. We're also going to do the player bit as part of Lab 6. And the real big benefit that we got from this, why did we go through all of this effort, is so that we can do things like this. When I click the national, it takes a moment. You see how the page rendered before the data rendered? That means that we can do things like show loading indicators. We can render the pieces of the UI that can be rendered right away and then wait a little bit to render the other pieces of the UI. But when I click the back button, everything is just there instantly. And that's because we cache those results. So now we have a way faster performing portal and a much faster page that our users are going to be really stoked about. And that's how we did it. We implemented it with that dependency. So before I go on to Lab 6. It's called Lab 5 in your printouts. This is the last lab is Lab 6. But before I push on, are there any questions about any of the stuff I just talked about? A lot of it's kind of dense code, but it's very valuable. Question right up here. There will be a microphone coming over to you from right over here.
Another question? So what was the reason again for hitting the ServiceNow endpoint, the REST endpoint for Spotify search instead of using the...
Great question. I'm going to talk about that right after we get done with Lab 6. I'm going to circle back and I'm going to talk about why we built that REST API service and a little plug for scripted REST APIs in ServiceNow as well. One more question over here. Oh, right there.
I apologize if this is a dumb question, but can you do like a control F5 or refresh to dump the cache just in case you're worried that something got stale on the information?
Yeah, so the part of the way that we implemented this cache is that we're just kind of loading it into the JavaScript runtime memory, which gets actually cleared out already as part of like a page refresh. So the contents of this cache will only stick around as long as we're still in the context of this single page app. So if we ever navigated away from Service Portal or refresh a page or something like that, all that stuff gets cached. And that's actually kind of a really great point to make because this raises an issue of, okay, so we're doing caches. And now we have to deal with cache invalidation, which for any of you who are familiar with computer science know that that's one of the two hardest problems in computer science. The other one is naming things. So figuring out when we have to clear that cache or how we do it or under what circumstances, or it's actually kind of challenging. And there's a couple ways that we can implement that. Like if we wanted this to be fast all the time at the cost of stale data, we could have saved that cache onto something like local storage inside of HTML5. Or save that content into a cookie or something somewhere, right? And that means that even if our user refreshes the page or comes back tomorrow, we're still loading results instantly. The problem with that is that if Radiohead comes out with a new album tomorrow, none of our Service Portal users will know about it. So this is why cache invalidation is kind of a challenging problem. There's no like kind of one-size-fits-all solution to it. There's whole branches of computer science that have been spun up in kind of in response to this. But you guys can figure out kind of a solution for your own purposes and figure out what works for you. I think in this case, what we have works pretty well for us. Any other there might have been a question over here. I don't remember. No? OK, awesome. Then we're going to push on to Lab 6. OK, so our new widget is pretty cool, but we still have this problem to deal with, right? We press the play button and it doesn't do anything, which is a bummer. So we're going to learn a little bit more about dependencies and how they work to figure out how we could use a dependency to inject something like a directive into here that embeds like a Spotify player. So we're going to take some time to do that now. So over here, navigate back to your Service Portal widgets. If you forgot how, you can just click into widgets, type widgets into the navigator over here and go into Service Portal widgets. OK, and from here, we're going to look for star Spotify once again. And we're going to pull up our Spotify Top Tracks widget once again. You might have already had it open earlier. If not, if you did, I apologize for making you do the same thing twice. And down here at the bottom, we have our dependencies list again. We already have one thing in here, but we're going to add another thing. And it's actually something that's also been provided for you. But we're going to take a second to look at that code and see how that works as well. So when we click Edit, and when we type Spotify into this / bucket, we'll see another Spotify-related thing pop up, and that's Spotify Player. Double-click that, move it over into the dependencies list for this widget. And when we click Save, we'll see that it is now there in Spotify Player. So the second step that you'll want to take here is head back over to GitHub. Well, actually, make sure that you have your Top Tracks widget open in the widget editor. That's Top Tracks, not the Artist Details one. And then head into your GitHub lab and go into Lab 6, Spotify Top Tracks. In this case, we only have one new thing, and that's our template. Go ahead and paste that in. You'll notice that only one new thing actually came in here, and that's this K17 Spotify Player thing. And this is what's called a directive. You might be familiar with directives already. This is just a plain old Angular directive that we're going to use to render our Spotify Player inside of here. And if we save this widget, then fingers crossed, now when I refresh this page, I should be able to click one of these results, and I actually see a Spotify Player pop up inside of the window. And I can play it, or oops, oh no, and then I have Spotify installed, so it goes and opens that. But yeah, And then that's it. So that's our Spotify top player, little player track that we included in there. And now we can go and check out the code and see how we're doing that part, because that's kind of neat. We're embedding this player from Spotify inside of an iframe and rendering that onto our page. I'm expecting to hear little like songs and stuff popping up. That happened last time. Okay, so if we step into the widget dependency for Spotify Player, and we click into Spotify Player here, then we'll see this Angular module, once again, called K17 Spotify Web Player in here, with a directive called K17 Spotify Player. And what we're returning here is pretty, undecorated Angular code where we're creating this new directive with an iframe inside of it. We're passing in as part of scope this thing called song. This is how we can pass in the unique URI for this song that we want to embed into the player. We're leveraging scope.song inside of right here. And then here we're doing this kind of weird looking code. Scope.embedded player URL is $SCE.trust as resource URL for this embed URL that Spotify provides us for embedding the player. And that's pretty hideous, but we do it for a reason, and it's for security. So we don't want to just render any content, any random content inside of an iframe in a widget or in any web application. And the reason for that is because there could be malicious actors out there that are trying to render iframes with their own web service inside of it to trick your users into going in and inputting their password or some other sensitive information. And we don't want that, right? So by default, Angular kind of locks that down. And if you try embedding something inside of an iframe without doing this step first, Angular will complain loudly, and it'll say, I don't trust this URL. I'm going to forbid it. And this is how we can tell Angular, look, don't forbid it. Allow this URL to work, because I'm programming you and I'm telling you to do it. So, and that's how that bit works. Other than that, there's really nothing to it. It's just another example of how we can use a dependency to kind of further extend the functionality of our widgets. And the cool part about including this as a dependency is, one, we get to write raw Angular code. Some of you might be attracted to that. Maybe some of you aren't, and that's okay. If you're not, we don't have to. And the second reason is so that we can reuse it between the rest of our widgets. So we can actually include that dependency inside of other widgets, and we can get some concept of code reuse. Maybe there's another widget, like top tracks of all time that's not related to an artist, a new widget, and we wanted to show a player inside of that. Well, we don't have to rewrite this code. We just have to remap it over into that new widget. So the second way that we could have done this, some of you that have some experience with Service Portal might be thinking, let me pull up my widget. So you might be thinking, Patrick, why didn't we use Angular providers? Don't you know that that's a thing? And I do know that that's a thing. There is actually a bug that some of you might have run into. I've seen a lot of activity on GitHub about this, and maybe some of you have run into it yourself. There's a bug right now in Service Portal where if you include an Angular provider that is either a service or a factory inside of this Angular providers list, everything will work. Everything will do what you think it'll do. We could have built our Spotify API service as an Angular provider in here. But what doesn't work is the designer. So if you take that widget that has those providers and you embed them onto the designer breaks. And we're fixing that. But it is still broken probably on many of your instances. So there are actually fixes to that, and I'm going to have documentation on GitHub about how you fix that particular problem, so you can look out for that in the Service Portal docs on GitHub, how to get past that issue. But I didn't think that we would have enough time to actually kind of run into that in this lab, and I didn't want to kind of struggle against that while we were trying to build a Spotify. So instead, I built it out as a dependency. Question right here. Microphone is on its way. Right over there.
Seeing as how there's two ways to do the same thing, and assuming both would work, is there a preference one over the other?
Yeah, so you'll notice that as you build Angular providers, if you click New here, you can just provide a directive, a factory, or a service right from here. And then you don't have to write quite as much code. You don't have to actually bootstrap the Angular module. This is how you can include directives or services or factories inside of the actual Service Portal Angular module instead of having to create an external Angular module that you try and link into. This is how you can include content into there. If it was working in the designer, it would be preferred. It's a little less code to write. I would say so. And it's actually worth noting here that the directive already works today. So inside of the designer. Again, there are ways to get the designer working if you want to use this. But really, dependencies and providers are just they're two kind of ways to do the same thing, right? I want to get other Angular code into my app, and I want to do it this way. So either way is fine. I personally have no preference one way or the other. Awesome. Yeah, totally.
So in your HTML template of your widget, you have K17-Spotify-player.
Yep.
And then in your Angular directive, you have K17-Spotify-web-player. And then also on in the Angular module name, it's also web player. So I was wondering where you are actually naming this Spotify player instead of Spotify web player.
Where I'm actually naming this piece that's highlighted, this bit?
Yes.
Yeah, so let me scroll down. If I go into my dependency, Spotify player. So we're looking at, so there's a few different places where we're pulling the name, right? The first one is this Angular module name. And that is coming from the name of this module here. So we're naming the module K17 Spotify web player, but that doesn't actually have any bearing on what the directive itself is called. That's coming from right here. .directive K17 capital Spotify capital player. You may be asking yourself, but there's no dashes in that, and there's camel case where there were dashes, and you have the Angular core team to thank for that great design decision. But this is how, when you're defining your directives, you would name them with this camel case notation, with the first letter being lowercase and then capitals after that. And then when you're actually leveraging it inside of your templates, because many HTML parsers are kind of not case sensitive or anything like that, you would replace the capital S with a dash lowercase s. And that's where that comes from. It's just kind of one of those little idiosyncrasies of Angular that you get used to eventually. Any other questions here? If there's not, I'm going to start talking about REST APIs inside ServiceNow and why we're doing the weird thing that we're doing that I was talking about earlier. One more question here.
Just a quick question on if you wanted a service to return data out of standard ServiceNow tables, is there something like that already built, or we have to build that service ourselves? Like
There's
we have one example is like a portal page where you have a whole bunch of widgets, say, related to KB, and you're having to pull the same KB stuff in all of them.
There's no client-side service for doing that I'm aware of. I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so. The question was, do we just use $HTTP to hit the REST API? You absolutely can. For example, if you wanted to do something like that, like maybe you're pulling the same data over and over again from some ServiceNow table, right? Like an incident table. That's a good example. So from your widgets that you're building and you keep pulling incident table for this data, what you could do is use the REST API, the table API that's provided by ServiceNow REST, and you can use that to kind of hit that API. Again, if you're calling from two different places, you might consider, again, implementing this kind of service to manage the flow of data and cache some of the results coming back, right? So that's definitely one way that you could implement something very similar. And this kind of theme comes up a lot, and I've spoken to a lot of people over the past week, and it's this idea of, okay, if we're starting to use REST services and we're starting to call into these services from the client, why do we have server scripts and widgets at all? And what do I put in those? And where do I use REST services instead? Which is a great question. And the kind of, in my opinion, the basic idea comes down to this, and a lot of it is just how you choose to engineer your particular solution. But in my opinion, you should think about it like this. So as you build widgets, some of them are going to be very simple, right? Some of them are not going to do all that much work, or some of them just kind of grab a couple of fields from the get parameter on $sp and then do something minor with that. That kind of code, you don't necessarily need to extract that out into some other like REST service and then just work with it through that, right? Maybe in those situations, just use the widget server script, right? In situations, though, where as your widgets kind of grow in complexity, and if they grow in complexity and you're doing more and more in them, and you start running into these duplicate patterns of code and lots of your widgets that might all be related to kind of the same thing, it becomes maybe you want to start thinking about how you take that code and extract it out into these RESTful services, right? That gives you a lot of advantages. You only have to write your code once. It leads to less bugs. It means that you can consume those REST APIs inside of other applications, even if they're not related to Service Portal, or even if they're not related to ServiceNow at all. It means that you can start implementing these caching layers and these common shared services, like what we did with the Spotify service. You can start doing stuff like that. So the answer is that there is no answer. But as you write more server script and widgets, you might consider kind of taking that and moving it somewhere else. I'm going to talk a little bit about where you would move that to and what a scripted REST API is and why we're using it for Spotify. This isn't in the labs. We're off the lab now. We're kind of off-roading, so let's go for it. So down here, if I search in the platform UI for scripted REST APIs, I find this. And this is just another ServiceNow product. It doesn't belong to the Service Portal team or belong to Service Portal in any way, but Service Portal does leverage it quite a bit. And all of you could leverage it as well. So from here, we have all of these different APIs that are exposed within ServiceNow or within this particular instance, right? We even see a couple that are, excuse me, one second. Yeah, talking for a week straight is pretty tough. We even see like an API for Service Portal Designer, and here's one for Spotify Service. So if I click into that, I actually see that Spotify service that we were hooking into earlier on from that Spotify API service that we built inside Service Portal, right? And here I'm giving it a name, I'm giving it an ID. It already has a base API path. This is how we hook into that REST API. You can provide security layers on top of this API, which is very valuable and might be exactly what you need. We don't have any for Spotify because it's an open API. We don't care who hits it. And then here I'm defining 3 resources. And a resource in REST language is basically like, it's kind of like an action. Get this thing, or create this thing, or delete that thing. Those are all resources. And in this case, we have 3 resources. They're all get actions. And they do various kind of retrievals from Spotify API. And if I click into one of them, then here's get artist. And get artist takes the same base API path as everything else, but we can also pass in this ID as a path parameter. And this allows us to leverage whatever was passed in as ID from that REST service. We can leverage it inside of our scripted, inside of the script block on this resource. And you notice that this script block actually looks a lot like the script block that we had inside of our widget server, script, right? In fact, it's almost directly copy and pasted. The only difference, oh, there we go. The only difference is to get that artist ID is we're pulling it off of path params. And that in turn is coming from the $sp.get parameter from our widget server script. So you can kind of see how that connection happens from our widget all the way through into this eventual REST API that we hit. Everything else is identical. Everything else works the exact same way. But the only difference is that we're modeling it as a REST API in ServiceNow. And that lets us handle it. Most importantly, it lets us handle it asynchronously. Because it means that we can just make that call and then just wait, do other stuff until it resolves eventually and comes back to us. And it also means that we can encapsulate all this code. So if we wrote another service, maybe you're building a, I don't know, maybe you're building a command line application and you want it to hit the same endpoints as your Service Portal widgets are, then that means that you can model all your complex logic. You can model that from scripted REST APIs. It still gives you the power of the ServiceNow platform. It still gives you glide record. It still gives you the ability to kick off workflows. It still gives you all the stuff that you want, but you can consume it from other places. And one of those places can be Service Portal. I suspect that this pattern will probably start to get more and more used as Service Portal widgets and as what's done on Service Portal continues to kind of scale up, right? And as more things start to be done on Service Portal and it's too complex to model inside of a widget anymore, then I suspect that this is where people will start to move. And this is where we're moving as a team as well, is to this idea of modeling things through REST services. And one more kind of aside is from this scripted REST service, a very useful tool that you might have had experience with, or maybe not, maybe you haven't seen it, is this link down here. It says Explore REST API. If I click that, then it takes me to a new page, kind of a new application within ServiceNow called the REST API Explorer. It lets you explore and construct requests to REST APIs. Awesome. OK, click Explore. Loads it up. And now I'm actually looking at that Spotify service through this REST API Explorer. I can also find all the other APIs that are available to me within ServiceNow. Here's a table API that I was talking about earlier. And from here, I can actually start sending kind of like test requests or fake requests to this REST API service, which means that I can start testing it from here. So as an example, let me show you. So I'm going to grab my artist ID from this Spotify artist page that I was looking at. I keep hearing people like kind of get the player working, and then I hear songs pop up. I think it's really funny. And from the REST API Explorer, in this ID, I can give it that ID, and it kind of creates that request for me. This is a really simple API, so I don't have to actually pass in anything else. I can choose who I want to send it as. I can choose the response format for what comes back. I can add more query parameters if I want to. But I'm just going to click Send. And then it says, OK, it returned. And here's the response body. And here's all the stuff that came back. Now, obviously, this is extremely useful when you're actually building these apps, and you don't want to have to keep testing inside of your widget, and you want to try and test your REST APIs in isolation. That's what the REST API Explorer is useful for. So this is how you can kind of start improving kind of the way that you're working on top of ServiceNow, starting to incorporate some of the other developer tools that we have available. I think scripted REST APIs maybe came out last knowledge. And then using kind of a blending of all of these different tools and all these different services within ServiceNow, you can start to build really powerful, really cool stuff on Service Portal. Are there any questions about all the stuff that I was just talking about? We went way off script. There's one over there. Microphone.
Thanks. So you showed us how to set up a promise script. Is there anything built in already for us for our table API? Or do we have to create that promise if we were to have multiple widgets accessing the same data?
Yeah, so that was a question that came up earlier, is there already some sort of a service inside Service Portal that just caches all that stuff for us? And the answer is no. You can build one yourself, certainly. The issue with kind of creating something like that is that the logic for how you're caching things and how you're building out these services will very likely vary depending on what it is that you're building. For example, if we cached results coming back from the incident REST API through the table API by default, then what we would end up with is a list that never updates, as an example, right? And maybe we want that stuff to update. Or maybe we want some of the content to be cached, but some of it to be fetched live. As you get into caching, you start to have to make these kind of engineering decisions and architectural decisions about when and how you want that cache to be cleared, or if you want one at all. Frequently, you don't want to cache. If I was building like a Connect widget, like to leverage our Connect messaging service in ServiceNow, and I wanted to embed messages onto the page, I probably would employ no caching for that, right? Because I always want the most up-to-date messages, and I want them as they come in. I want to pull the server every time I do that. So long answer to a short question, which is no, we don't provide that out of the box. But using this simple kind of technique and writing 10 lines of code, it's pretty straightforward to build it in yourself if that's what you want on your widget. You got to make the decision of, is that what you want? Any other questions?
Oh, perfect. Excuse me, sorry.
I heard something from somewhere. Nothing? Okay, cool. So I'm out of topics. I think I just about covered everything that I wanted to cover.
You have a question?
Another question? Awesome. Yeah, keep the questions coming. No, this is Q&A session now, so.
So the REST message outbound, so can we implement that using our preview scripts, something like that, just to get that script and use it in a widget, in a server-side script?
So let me make sure I'm understanding the question. So is it that you want to call one of the ServiceNow REST APIs from a server script? Is that?
Let's say using a REST message and connect to, for example, info block, right? I get all the data, right? Let's say the get method, and I preview the script, right? The test script, get all the script, right? So can I use that script in the widget server-side scripting?
I'm not sure I'm following the question totally. Will, do you have any takes on this? Also, sitting in the back of the room is Will Langang. He's also one of the developers on Service Portal. Super smart guy if you ever get the chance to talk to him. Which you will at the end of this session, so go talk to him.
Let me try and answer your question. Can you show me?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure. I might have to circle back to that. Microphone here. Uh-huh. I see. So the question is, can you use the REST message v2 syntax from your server script? As long as that's a service that's available from any other server script inside of the instance, totally. I embarrassingly don't know. I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't know. I'll look into that though. I'm curious as well because I'm not sure. My suspicion is that they're both blocking. So even if we use that, we might have still wanted to move to this new kind of method of modeling these requests coming from the client instead. That would be my guess because server scripts themselves and widgets are blocking or synchronous.
Just in thinking about your caching issue, is there a way that you could have an asynchronous call that's sitting there? It's on the page that maybe you can invalidate that it's actually looking kind of like a watcher.
Yeah. Let me make sure I understand. So like a watcher, like instead of polling the server script or polling that service for give me updates, instead say something like notify me when an update comes in.
Right.
Yeah.
Something that was separate from what you actually got on the page, and then where you're caching, but you have something that's kind of a dirty cache that's sitting back there that when it gets dirtied, you refresh your own cache.
Yeah, totally. And you would need some logic around that to determine what makes a cache dirty. But yeah, you could absolutely structure it that way. In fact, a way that we could have structured this thing was we could have done kind of a hybrid in this service of like provide like polling or like a poll kind of functionality as well as like a push functionality coupled on top of it. I don't know if it directly kind of talks about the thing that you're talking about, but it's this idea that like we could configure this thing so that anytime any widget makes a call to this service, then it'll automatically push those updates down to all the other widgets, whether they ask for it or not, to keep everything up to date all the time whenever anything gets called, which could be really interesting, right? And we can do that with a simple kind of watcher pattern inside of our services. If we structured it, I don't have it open right now, but we could like register from a widget. We could call like Spotify API service dot on artist change or something like that and give it a callback. And then from that callback, whenever another widget pulls for new stuff, and if there's something new, which we can check inside the service, then we can just call those callbacks that got registered back into the widget, which could be a pretty interesting kind of functionality and keeps all the content on our page fresh and everything. That could be really cool. Not implemented here, obviously, but maybe exercise for the readers or the viewers. I don't know if any of that made sense. I don't know if I explained that well at all, but. Anything else? Oh, one more, and then we're going to wrap it up. I don't know how long the lab instances last for. Will, do you know? A day. They last a day. Yeah, so act quick. But my GitHub with all the code on it, that'll stay up forever, as long as I'm at ServiceNow. And then when I'm not at ServiceNow, I'm going to delete it with bitterness. Yeah. Yeah, I will. Yeah, totally. I'll include that stuff. I might even just include the update sets that has all this stuff, actually. That might be easiest. I'll just include the update sets for the lab and GitHub so you can check that in the future, and that'll be there. OK, well, that's it. Thank you so much for spending the end of CreatorCon with me. It means a lot. Thank you. And thank you guys. You know, great CreatorCon. Nice. Good job.